got a great panel here today to discuss harm in new and minority religions and sources of support. There are other people I know on the call with valuable things to offer, and I hope that people feel that they are able to put up their hand and make comments, ask questions, respond to what contributors have said. And if you want to use the chat box to put in any information to share, or also if you want to ask a question, you can use that form too. So in recent years, there's been lots of research and raising of awareness about different forms of abuse in mainstream religions, physical, sexual abuse, also spiritual abuse, and a greater understanding about how coercive control operates in relation to domestic abuse, for example, or in relation to grooming or trafficking. And there's also increasing awareness about what the effects of that abuse is on victims and survivors, and about the kind of support that they might need. In the UK, we've got an independent educational charity called Inform, which provides information about minority religions and sex. It's been going for about 35 years, I think, and has been on my radar ever since I began specialising in religious affairs as a journalist. Last weekend, it ran a seminar with global contributions on how to direct survivors of abuse to the best sources of support. It was organised with assistance from the Religion and Sexual Abuse Project, which encourages and supports academic study into abuse. And some of the people who took part in that seminar are joining us as our panellists today. And I'll just briefly tell you who they are. There's Dr Suzanne Newcombe, who's the Honorary Director of Inform, Tenzin Peljor from Tibet House in Germany, Sam Downs, Head of Intervention Support at InfoCult, which is based in Montreal, although he's joining us from Germany, and Justin Humphreys, who's the CEO of safeguarding organisation 31 in the UK. So, as I say, we're going to talk about the kind of support that survivors need, but I think in order to understand those needs, we do first of all have to talk a little bit about the environments in which abuse takes place. The term that's often used these days is sort of high demand groups, and have a brief discussion around some of the terms that we use. But I want to start with the use of the word cult. And I'm going to start with you, Suzanne. I'm going to get all of you just to give me a sort of a brief response to this question, because I know that cult is a word that Inform actually avoids. I wonder if you could tell us why that is.
Thanks, Rosie. Inform was established in 1988 by Professor Eileen Barker at the London School of Economics. And at that time, there was a lot of pressure in the media and in other quarters to create a list of groups that were socially problematic and perhaps should be banned in legislation. And it tended to be under the word of cults. And often people use cults as a shortcut and not very precise word for religions they have concerns about or they don't like. So when people come to us, Inform's mission is to provide information that is accurate and up to date about minority religions and groups that might be put under the label of cults. And so we try to make this information much more specific, and what exactly are the behaviors or the beliefs you're concerned about, and what exactly is the evidence for this group at this time. And we try to triangulate as many perspectives as possible to get the best sources of information. But one of the important things that's happened in the last 35 years since our founding is that the conversation has really shifted, and cult in cultic are used much more loosely and are also an important part of people who've had negative experiences in a whole spectrum of organizations. It's no longer targeting specific groups, but it's also used in relation to much more mainstream churches for people who've had negative experiences. And it's a word that's sometimes used to explain people's experiences as they move towards reassessing what's been happening.
So you might not have the same problem with it now that you did then. And Sam, I mean, the work you do in many ways is similar to the work of Inform, but in your very title, you have the word cult, so you don't have a problem with that word. Just tell us a little bit about what the word cult means in your work.
Yeah, I actually wouldn't exactly say that we have no issue with the term cult. And especially when we're communicating with journalists and advising journalists on how to approach this issue, we really discourage that they use the term because of the academic issues around it, because it is such a stigmatizing term. But the side of our organization that's dedicated to communicating with the public and on the terms that the public is familiar with to describe these high control religious and ideological movements writ large, it really helps us in our outreach to make reference to the terms that they're used to. So I presented over the weekend about our support group specifically. And one thing I wanted to highlight is actually the definition that we use for former members of what kind of group, former member of cult, or what the criteria is in our description of that service is that it's intended for those who have experienced or are experiencing controlling relationships, including various challenges in connection with groups, systems, or environments with a high level of commitment, demand, or control. So that's a very broad definition. And we do find participants coming to the group quite adamantly saying, I was in a cult, and getting a lot of personal benefit out of using stigmatizing language for their negative experiences and finding that therapeutic on a certain level. And there are other people in that group who really appreciate the ability to not label their experiences as such and to use other terms or to describe their experiences without reference to that kind of label. And we do try and create as much space as possible for that that nuance and that range of terms.
Because Tenzin, I mean, you're a Buddhist, but you would say that you are also a survivor of a cult. Is that, am I right?
Yes, and sometimes I stress I'm a cult survivor, actually of 2 Buddhist cults. And in the beginning, 2004, when I started to educate on issues or wanted to inform the public, we have problems in Buddhism. I created a German website in 2004 and called it Buddhist cults, but with cults in apostrophes, because I knew about the controversy using the term. And also I wanted to be taken seriously with the problems I raise. And academics would not have taken me seriously if I had stressed this term too much. So for a long time, I quite deliberately and carefully avoided the use of the term cult. But in recent years, I more loosely used it because I felt there's also more acceptance for it. And especially many survivors of high demand groups find support in so-called anti-cult literature and terminology they sometimes use. So to build a bridge and sometimes also to raise awareness in the public, we have some problems here, be careful. I use then the term cultator for alarming, as alarming sign, or just to cut down a discussion. Here's a problem, and should just give it a label which raises some, you must be careful here, or here's a problem, something like this. So I had a development with the usage of this term, and nowadays I use it also more loosely, and it's not as controversial as it was in the past.
Thank you. Justin, I mean, you're working mainly with sort of mainstream religions. Is it at all helpful in the work that you do, this term?
I think it's helpful to a point, but I think, as is already being discussed, it does have different connotations in the minds of different groups. I don't think that in the world that we tend to inhabit, that it is as well understood as it needs to be. And the distinctions between cults, sects, new religious movements, how they interplay with what might be perceived as mainstream religion, it just isn't sufficiently understood. So it depends who we're talking to about whether they find the term helpful or not, in fairness.
I think it's interesting, isn't it, that it's often a useful term for survivors to explain their experience, almost, you know, whatever environment they've been in, whether it's been a sort of mainstream religion or a minority religion. Just a tiny bit more on terms. I mean, Suzanne, when you talk about, well, 2 things you talk about. You talk about new religious movements, some of which probably are getting quite old now. And you talk about minority religions. I mean, with minority religions, presumably this is dependent on where you are. So in the UK, being a Mormon would be belonging to a minority religion, but if you live in Utah, it isn't. So is that how you see the term minority religion?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's pointing out that all of these ideas of stigmatized groups are context dependent, and it's trying to pull out the most relevant characteristics for the purpose at hand. So we're very much opposed to headlines saying this group is always bad, because that prevents change and prevents improvement, which the word cult can tend to do. But definitions of minority religions and new religions are also very context dependent and change over time. So it's, if you want to be precise with your language, you've got to really think about the context and the meaning of the word you're using.
But in the UK, Buddhism is a minority religion.
Yes, we'd say that, and sometimes it would be a new religion, because one of the we try to be as inclusive as possible in the groups we research and look at, and one of the first definitions of new religion were things that came to Britain in a new form after World War II. And so this is a tradition that is often first generation membership. People are usually in Britain not born into Buddhism, and this means it has different characteristics, or they're part of an immigrant community, which also has a specific relationship to the more mainstream English culture.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the characteristics of the sort of the high demand groups that you're seeking to sort of find support, or not support for the groups of people who've come out of these groups. I mean, what are the key characteristics of high demand groups where abuse might be fostered? I'll keep with you, Suzanne, just for a moment, and then do chip in, everyone.
I think that it's really important to emphasize the range of experiences, which I think as we're getting much more understandings in mainstream traditions, in our culture, like there wasn't even a word for sexual harassment 40, 50 years ago. So we're coming up with much more nuanced understandings of how people feel manipulated, and the social pressure to do things that they might later regret, or feel that they really didn't want to do but went along with it at the time. So things like gaslighting, denying of people's experiences, financial control, and other aspects of coercive control with children who grow up in these movements. There's specific experiences and enculturations. And I think it's also really important that these are whole cultures. So often people who are experiencing pressure to do things that cause harm to others are also encouraged to perpetuate these systems in a more or less reflective way.
So I'm just wondering about, abuse happens across a whole range of settings. We're looking particularly at religious settings and sort of groups within religions. So I'm just wondering, what is it that makes a person particularly vulnerable to being abused in those settings? What are the characteristics of those settings? Sam, I don't know if you'd like to say something about this.
Certainly, and especially, I mean, as to the sort of previous question about what are some of the characteristics of these groups, something that comes up very often in our work in particular is the creation of an us versus them, in group versus out group, us versus the world kind of narrative. These certainly can also develop in groups that don't necessarily exert a high level of control over their membership, but that factor in combination with other factors can create a situation that is all the more difficult for people to deal with in the time after they've left. And so I would say that is one of the ingredients, especially as it plays into the group's ability to isolate its members from the rest of society, that we see becoming particularly problematic for people in the period of their life after they've exited, and can also make it harder to exit.
I mean, another feature, which we've been hearing a lot about a particular organisation in the UK recently, is the profile and the power of the leader. Justin, do you want to say a little bit about that? And then Tenzin, I'm going to ask you about that.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. Both the type of power that is often exhibited by leaders, others of influence, whether that's relational, positional, charismatic power, how all of those things are brought together and have, in a sense, an additional layer of complexity to them when they are taking place within an environment of faith, belief, religion, spirituality more broadly. And they play into often the fact that certainly in the UK to a large extent, we focus on both, or either the emotional or physical elements of abuse, and we forget the spiritual element, which clearly is relevant to all of us, but is probably more clear in these kinds of environments. So what we often find is that charismatic, largely leader will place themselves as a figure to not be challenged, that they are hearing directly from divine entity, God. Therefore, what they are saying to you or the vulnerable person, let's say, is everything. You are to do what is being suggested. You are not to challenge. And this sense that those sorts of dynamics can be created where there is an absence of accountability is where we run into a whole lot of problems and issues, such as those that you've alluded to, Rosie, more recently. So I think there are additional complexities around the power dynamics at play in these environments where spirituality is important.
And Tenzin, I mean, within Buddhism, you've got, there's a very strong issue around the relationship between the guru and the guru's disciples, such that it's very, very difficult to challenge that the guru often, and it's presented as if you do it, well then it's it's going against the teaching of the faith.
Not necessarily. Actually, the teachings and also those teachers stress you should check the teacher, but in a way, not of course the teacher of this group. It's a bit it's ambiguous, and actually I think it's more complex to talk about this teacher-student relationship. I would like to pick up 2 points to the vulnerability of someone who enters in such a group, and the teacher should just expand what's said before, points where I think they were not touched. Is this okay, Rosie?
Yeah.
So, for instance, what my understanding is, everybody is, of course, vulnerable based on certain causes and conditions, and this is always individual. Some people might be vulnerable because they got too less love when they grew up, and they're still seeking for love and being accepted, being seen. And then so-called cults can give you a lot of attention and love. In the beginning, we call it in the anti-cult language love bombing. And this is so nourishing for your mind. So this is a vulnerability of a certain group of people. But also vulnerability can be you are just open for a change, and you are ready to question your life, your values and everything. And this openness itself makes you vulnerable. And then combined with this, you don't know usually much about the religion or this religious group, and maybe there is not even critical information about this group. This is another key factor of the vulnerability. And a third factor, especially in Buddhism, is the naivety. Whatever is Buddhism is necessarily good. So, and it's Susan said correctly, it's a new religion according to definition. For many, it's a mainstream religion. It's one of the 5 great religions or something, they say like this. So this is are some key aspects of vulnerability, which can happen to anyone. And then in it comes in, which Stephen Hassan calls fuzziness. It's not so clear. So the teacher might say, actually our perception are not reliable because we are, and then you think it's true, sometimes I are, but you are not always. But this will be then used to manipulate your self-trust, your self-esteem, and what I call operating in the realm of fuzziness, you don't really realize what's going on. So that's why everybody can become a victim of a high demand group just on certain conditions. And it happens to anyone, no matter how intelligent this person is. And I think a key aspect is this openness for change and this fuzziness, where it's difficult to pinpoint what's right and wrong.
But can I just ask you to address the question of the relationship between the teacher and the disciple, because this is a key relationship within some of these Buddhist organizations, isn't it? You sit at the feet of the teacher, and they have the knowledge, and therefore they have the power.
Yes, they have the power, and then you don't know, and then they know. So, and if they are the only source of authority, which touches the issue, how is this teacher established? These so-called cult leaders, they have no one on the same level or higher level which can correct them. They tend to isolate themselves from their environment to be the single sole power in that group. So, and then once you follow a group, you only have this authority and maybe only his books and texts, which you should study. And then you get dependent on all the information you receive there. And then, of course, you accept, I don't know, he knows. And this opens a duality where, especially with the context of the isolation of the teacher and the isolation of your group, where you are not anymore able to question the teacher. And then in the teachings, it's also demanded to see this teacher as a Buddha, as an enlightened being. So if you see any fault with the teacher, it's the fault of your mind, it's your projection. Yeah. And this reverses the whole thing, because everything good goes to the teacher, everything bad is your fault, and then you get totally lost.
And then there's also the question, isn't there, about loyalty to the community, which you'll get in a lot of groups where trying to call something out is perceived as sort of being disloyal to the group, or in some religions bringing shame on a community and so on. I just wonder if we could just talk a little bit about the nature of high demand groups, which means they are so much more difficult to leave than perhaps if you're in in your local parish church or your local mosque and something happens, and it might be easier to get out and go to the one down the road. But what is it about these high demand groups which means that it's harder to leave? Suzanne?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's lots of ways that people become really enmeshed in a group, and that's often what's attractive about them, because they provide meaning and purpose to life, they provide a social life, they provide financial security, and the more involved you are, what a kind of economist might call, you have sunk costs. So the harder it is to say, I'm going to abandon all this I've invested in my friends, my family, my employment, and step away from it. That's a succinct answer.
I suppose there are mainstream religions where you invest so much through your family and your community that actually it's just as difficult to leave, really.
Absolutely. And I think that a sign of a healthy community or a healthy relationship with the group is having outside interests, having other people to talk to, having other sources of self-worth and identity. And that's both a sign of a high demand group, but it's also, whatever group you're in, people can develop these unhealthy relationships, and you get pockets within much more mainstream where these unhealthy relationships develop. And that's why the kind of cultic terminology is used much more broadly these days, because there is a better understanding of that dynamic as being the problem rather than a specific organization.
Well, before we talk about survivors' needs, I suppose we're talking about the need for organizations to have good safeguarding. And Justin works in this area with sort of on the whole sort of mainstream majority religions and their safeguarding. And so I'm going to ask you first of all, Suzanne. I mean, why did you feel that contribution from Justin's contribution was valuable in talking about new religious movements, minority religions, sects?
I mean, what Justin offers is a really positive vision of how to create more healthy cultures, and which prevents a lot of these harmful dynamics, whatever the culture might be. And one of the things that we really want to highlight of speaking with people involved in groups in all sorts of ways over the last 35 years is that people have lots of different needs and they want to have different relationships with the group. Some of them, as Sam was mentioning, want to leave and say that this group is a cult and never come back, but others want to create change from within the organization and reform the culture, and others have a kind of intermediary position, or we're grown up within a group and can't quite leave the language they've been brought up with and their families there, and they want to connect with it, but they also want to separate themselves. So it's a really complex area, and I think Justin's contribution has really wide applications on how to create more healthy cultures in organizations that still have a vision of transforming the world for the better, which is what attracts people to many of these groups.
I mean, I suppose the thing is, Justin, isn't it, that I mean, there will be some cults, or there are some groups that are very are consciously harming people, but actually maybe there are more which just aren't aware of the way they operate in sort of unconscious ways, which means that abuse happens.
Yeah, I think that's right, to a degree, Rosie. And what we certainly found over the decades that we've been working in this area, particularly when we're thinking about what is defined as spiritually abusive behavior on the part of leaders, although not exclusively leaders, is that they have more often than not unwittingly fallen into patterns of harmful behavior rather than setting out with the intention of causing harm to individuals. That's not to say that, you know, those sorts of people aren't out there. Yes, they are, but in our experience, they are the minority by a long way. But I think one of the things that's played into this and how we understand it is potentially that we've created safeguarding to become a bit of a bureaucratic process. And of course, there are bureaucratic elements to it. So our policies and our procedures and our training, our vetting, all those things are really important when we are convening groups and entities and institutions. But what we're finding is that the culture that sits beneath or around all of those things has not been sufficiently looked at. So these settings can say, well, look, we've got all of this. We've got our policy, we've got our procedures, and we do all the right training. But there are then indicators that the culture is really not sufficiently embedded, understood. It isn't modeling safer behaviors. It is allowing shadow practices and beliefs to take root, which then impinge upon the culture and the values and then ultimately the behaviors that exist within that entity. So it's extremely complex. And I think going back to Tenzin's point, it's really key here. Our understanding of vulnerability also plays into this significantly, because we have legal definitions in the UK around what a vulnerable person is, but they're not always particularly helpful in the context that we're looking at here. Because, as Tenzin has reminded us, vulnerability exists for all of us at different times for different reasons. And oftentimes, individuals are caused to be vulnerable by the very environments in which they are interacting with others. You know, they don't enter it feeling that they are vulnerable or carrying that label. That's deeply unhelpful most often. But they become vulnerable and they are held vulnerable by those environments and the cultures that underpin them.
Something that comes to mind around this is that there's also, rather than sort of a black and white, there is harm or there isn't harm in a particular environment, you can see a gradient, a spectrum of harms. And I think that some of the beginnings of the seeds of things that can develop into quite serious problems can be found in most societies and organizations, can be found in nonprofits and academic spheres and so on and so forth. And one of those kind of spectrums, I feel, is the balance between responsibility and reputation for an organization, and the tendency towards protecting the reputation of the organization as a whole, and therefore from their perspective, protecting the group as a whole, the larger number of people in the group as a whole, over taking responsibility to harm to individuals. And I think that piece, that sort of tendency away from taking responsibility, is something that most social organizations actually do struggle with. And that's one of the reasons why it can be helpful to move away from cult as a label, is these cases where we can see some of these at play in a much broader sphere and not unique to only groups that have beliefs that may seem strange or foreign or unusual to us.
Okay, now can I come to now the question of what sort of support is needed, because obviously it entirely depends on the experience that somebody has had within a high demand group. But just Sam, could you just sort of give a sort of an idea of the range of support that might be necessary for somebody who's attempting to leave a high demand group?
Absolutely. So if this person is freshly out of an environment where they weren't able to accrue sort of personal independent finances and so on, then in the immediate term, people will often need help with housing, with feeding themselves, with meeting their basic needs. And that is a huge hurdle to get over for a lot of people. But then beyond that, and stretching sort of into the future from that point where those basic needs are addressed, there is very frequently a sense of alienation and differentness from the rest of the people who they interact with, and a lot of self-blame around those differences that they feel that they have. And so interacting with other people who have had some of those same experiences and breaking the isolation is a really important step on the level of psychological and emotional recovery. And that is really why we adopted this support group and a peer support model in particular, rather than a therapy support group or whatever else kind of system, is that there is this distinct benefit to allowing people to have exchanges as peers and openly express themselves. It helps in part break isolation, but also as a side benefit, helps deal with some of that self-blame that can come along with it.
I'm interested that you also recognise and work with the families of survivors, and I just wonder about that. I suppose, if you're a relative and you've got somebody coming out of a very traumatic experience, family members need support too.
Absolutely. For family members, because our family members group is also open to people who have a loved one who's currently in one of these groups, very often the immediate need is for developing communication strategies to not have contact cut with that person, or to create opportunities for future communications and to be prepared for future communications if contact has already been cut. So that's one distinct area. But then knowing how to be gentle and having the information you need to be sympathetic with that person and to give them the time and the space that they need to heal is also a very important part of it for those people who do know former members. And then also to have a space to express frustration, because one of the things that these family members can feel is being asked from them is that they have to be infinitely giving and put away all of their judgment and put away all of their frustration with the situation. So having a space that is closed off and that is totally confidential, where they can air out those negative emotions and the difficulties that they're having in that process, can be really useful for them to be able to have the strength to have that patience that's necessary in coping with the immediate situation with their loved one.
I think it might be really useful, Sam. I'll give you a little bit of time to think about it, so I'll go away and come back again. But to have an example, perhaps, of somebody who came out of a particular group, and if you can name it, then do. You know, to have somebody in your mind to tell us, you know, what they came out, this is what they did, this is how we supported them, just to sort of try and put a little bit more of a picture to the sort of situation that you're dealing with. I mean, Suzanne, here in the UK, we've had a recent report from Colin Bloom on government engagement with faith groups. And in that, one of his recommendations was that the government should fund a programme that supports people who leave high demand groups. Well, firstly, what might that programme involve if the government agreed to fund it? And secondly, do you think there's any chance that they might?
I think that there are lots of interesting things in the Bloom report, and the general call for more support for people in these situations, I think, is very appropriate and very needed. I don't think it's hugely up on the government's agenda, but issues of harm in faith communities are of concern to constituents, and they are in the headlines from time to time. I think that the two things I'd like to really say in response to that are there needs to be not just one agency. There's lots of needs, and this is a really diverse communities. So there's need for information, there's need for those basic needs, there's need for peer support of people with similar experiences. There's also need for personal reflection in those safe spaces to reevaluate one's past experiences and one's ongoing choices. So there's lots and lots of different needs, and there's no one path for any person. And the other thing that I found I wanted to say in response to the report is that the distinction that it makes between make-believers and true believers, I think, is really unhelpful and damaging.
What do they mean by make-believers and true believers?
The report is kind of set on a premise that true believers are good and don't cause harm, and only people who cause harm are not doing real religion or make-believing their faith because they set out to harm people. And if you work in this space for any length of time, you realize that people harm people while thinking they're doing the best for them. But this still needs to, and they might have a very strong faith, but they need to understand how this is causing harm, and it's quite complex to draw that to their intention, which Justin perhaps has the most experience with.
That's where the idea of understanding of spiritual abuse comes in, perhaps, because I mean, I suppose if somebody is physically abusing or sexually abusing somebody, they're probably, they probably know that they're doing something wrong. But where they're spiritually abusing somebody, they might not. Justin?
I think that's true. And Sam's already alluded to a spectrum of behavior, which is something that we were thinking about last weekend. That we do indeed see a spectrum of behavior that exists in these environments, whether it leads at the extreme end to spiritual abuse or frankly any other form of harmful behavior. So moving through a spectrum from what we might describe as healthy through to what might be unhelpful, something that's unhealthy, and then something that becomes harmful. And we do see that individuals will travel up and down that spectrum, and it is for the wider community and hopefully the accountability mechanisms that you would like to think exist to bring challenge to when an individual's behavior travels too far along that continuum or that spectrum, if you like. But it's true to say that where we are looking at spiritual abuse, there will be those who genuinely believe that the way they are communicating their belief, their understanding of sacred text or whatever it might be, is the truth, is the way, is helpful, and they're not sufficiently attentive to the harmful impact that both the message and the way the message is communicated is impacting the lives of individuals. So it is extremely complex, and I take Suzanne's challenge as to whether we can really categorize them as true believers, make believers. I think I understand what Colin Bloom is trying to say there. I think in reality it's probably far more nuanced in most cases.
Tenzin, can you speak a little bit to the situation faced by survivors leaving Buddhist organisations like the one that you left, and their needs. And do you find that the survivors that you work with want to stay within the Buddhist fold, or want to walk away completely? And what sort of support do you find that there is for them in sort of other Buddhist organizations?
I think, first of all, it's not clear for someone who leaves a Buddhist group, which has unhealthy structures and where they have experienced great harm, if they want to continue with Buddhism for their spiritual journey or not. It sorts out gradually, and much of it depends upon how to their abuse, their harm, and their pain is being responded by the Buddhist organizations and by peers. And my observation is the amount of cruelty by Buddhists against survivors of abuse can be, or the ignorance can be so hard for many. It blocks, first of all, their healing. It harms them afterwards, the harm after the harm, you could say. And so over a period of time, their pain and harm can turn towards anger, deep hate against Buddhism or religion and all types of authority. So it's like in all the other cases, it's always an individual process. But my observation is only a few stick on with Buddhism. Some change religion, some try to find spirituality on their own. And I seem to be one of the very few, even who is nowadays still a monk.
If you're saying that many people just feel that they need to leave Buddhism altogether, why were you able to stay?
Because I got all the support I needed.
What was that support?
Yeah, I can tell you, first of all, the first 4 years, basically those groups hijack your basic needs. So you are encouraged to move to the center, to live there. You're discouraged to work, to give your time, money, energies, or savings all to the group and so on. So you are totally dependent for survival on the group. Your identity is attached to the group, your safety, security, roof over the head, and so on. This makes you highly dependent. So, and when I left the group, I had friends who also came from the group who gave me a roof where they didn't have to pay a rent. So I had friends who understood me. And I got information from a Harvard doctorate, Alexander Bursin, who helped me to understand the distortion, which were part of the indoctrination and the gaslighting I experienced. So a very complex setup helped me to continue and to find a better nuanced understanding of Buddhism, and also to heal from my post-traumatic stress disorder. And it seems to be I'm quite of an exception, because when I came out of the group and also later, there were no safe and healthy supportive peer groups, which nowadays offers, for instance, InfoSector in Canada. Yeah. And we had a self-help forum. It was called New Kadamba Survivors, but it was led by survivors, by traumatized people. It was hijacked by the New Kadamba tradition, who put on spies, caused division and so on. And so, and sometimes also survivors triggered each other's trauma. So it was very unhealthy, and we were not really able to support us in healthy ways. So I had the good luck to find all what I need.
Thank you. And Sam, I've given you a little bit of time. Have you got sort of an example you can share? Tenzin's just told us how he got support, but can you give an example of somebody who's come out and been helped in some way?
For sure. So what I'm going to do is sort of go over a particular trajectory of intervention, but I'm not going to give any personally identifying information about the person or their former group, because that's a whole confidentiality issue in terms here. I would have had to prepare something further in advance for that. But so someone comes to us having left an ideological movement and feels the need for support services, wants to make their story known to the public, and also is currently accessing services through a number of other organizations that deal with, say, radicalization. And in particular, wants our advice navigating services from those organizations, as well as sort of interpersonal support. So the first step is we talk to that person, we sit down and speak with them about what their needs are, what their experiences were in the group. We identify a therapist that might be appropriate to their particular situation. We give them advice on interacting with the media and accessing sort of any legal help that they might need to properly navigate their interactions with the media, provided that they have the resources to access that legal help and advice. And
What about the dangers of interacting with the media? I mean,
yes. Oh, yes. That's a big part of that whole talk. Whenever people come to us and say, I want to go and talk to the media, a whole conversation about the risks involved in such a thing. And if they're willing to accept those risks, how to moderate them in the way that they're interacting with the media. And then forward from there. So that person then accesses therapy, accesses a support group, and accesses advising on how to deal with these other related issues like interacting with the media. Later down the line, they have several conflicts with members of online forums and find that a lot of the support in the forum spaces and online that they've tried to access has been by people who don't share their vision of their experiences, and they feel very pressure to adopt other people's ideas about how they should feel about their experiences. So they stray away from those sources and go more towards more confidential, enclosed spaces for communications about their experiences, where they feel less pressured to adopt a particular narrative. And they also eventually, over time, come to identify not only the ideological movement that they just exited as being cultic in some way, but they also start to identify the religious affiliation of their parents as having been cultic in some way or high demand, and as having shaped their life and shaped their eventual decision to join this very different ideological group, but which informed their engagement with it. So, you know, these kinds of interventions can implicate all of these different needs for different sources of support, different areas of the person's life, and the different groups that they're interacting with after their time in the high demand group, and also can then lead to reflections on the influence of ideologies and religions in their life, extending back into their childhood as well.
Thank you. Now, we've just got a few minutes left, and I don't know if there's anybody on the call who's not spoken who'd like to. If they would like to, just let me know, put a hand up. I think it may also be that the four of our contributors have are burning to say something which they haven't said yet and which I haven't thought to ask them. So if that's the case, please alert me as well. Justin, I just wonder how you shared with me some sort of reflections on the nature of power, which I think you also shared at the weekend seminar. I wonder if you could just sort of offer those while other people think if they've got something they want to add to what they've already said.
Yeah, sure. What we were focusing on last weekend, and we chatted about briefly, were just a reminder of some of the different types of power that exist and that are held by individuals in some of these high demand environments that we're thinking of. So the differences between reward-based power, i.e. that says you will be rewarded for your compliance regarding a particular issue. Coercive power, which, as it suggests, is purely about one person exerting power over another person to encourage or influence them to behave or think in a way that's contrary to what they would normally. And looking at that alongside what we might describe as legitimate power, which is power that might be held by somebody by virtue of who they are, their status as given to them in society, something about which they have very little control for themselves. And then something about informational power, you know, the knowledge is power, kind of, you know, I know this, I have access to all this information, I can intellectualize this subject that we're talking about, therefore my position can be used over yours. That's closely related to expert power. And then finally, we were thinking about relational and charismatic power. You know, those elements of power that are conferred and then used in return, often in a very insipid, nuanced way to persuade somebody that you are worth following, believing, complying with, and almost that there might be a divine element to that, that there at the end of it we can loop back to the reward and consequence. If you don't, there may well be consequences for you, you know. So all sorts of different types of power that we need to be aware of, so that hopefully in the environments that we're in, we can challenge them, and that we can encourage those that are able to remove themselves from those high control, high demand environments, to see those power dynamics for what they were and are.
Thank you. Tenzin, you wanted to add something about the needs of survivors.
Yes, some of the needs of survivors are nowadays met. For instance, with Inform, survivors can report their experience and give their testimonies confidentially. And then also there are safe online groups like from InfoSec the Cult. But what we also lead usually as survivors, we have a tendency to warn others, to protect them from harm. So what we need is information in the public space about there are people who have been harmed. And this would be the task of the media, and they are far too uncritical towards Buddhism. But it would also be a part of institutions like Inform to have a public leaflet. There are some complaints about these groups, this and this direction. And then also we need safe sources of support. So for instance, some people go to a psychotherapist. The psychotherapist might be a mindfulness teacher of exactly that group where you have experienced the harm. Or some medical doctors in Great Britain said, but Buddhism is good, you should have faith in the Buddhist group and the leader and so on. So there needs be more education on the institutional and the public side to report and give survivors voices and experience more space. And also in the academic field, because sometimes survivor voices were silenced. They were quoted in academic papers, but then said, but the institution said this is not right. And then something like overwriting survivors' voice. This is also not so helpful, because then people cannot be protected to think for themselves, maybe here is a potential harm for me. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, there's something about the visibility of these issues, isn't there? That we've got a lot of religious education experts involved in the Religion Media Centre, and it would be very interesting to sort of talk to them about what sort of education there is in schools about the potential for abuse within mainstream and minority religions. I think that's where we will end, unless anybody is burning to say anything now. But I would like to thank you all, Tenzin, Sam, Suzanne and Justin, and those others of you who have attended, and to the Religion Media Centre for hosting this. I think it's been really interesting. I think we could spend a lot longer discussing as well, and maybe we will another time. Thank you very much indeed. Bye for now.